Okay, so here again in this video, we're going to talk overview of both the process of cell respiration and the process of photosynthesis. But here we're actually going to look at everything that goes in to the two processes, as well as what comes out and the intermediates. So this picture right here is a mitochondrion. So remember that these are organelles that are located in all eukaryotic cells. So when we talk eukaryotes, we're talking everything besides bacteria. So protists, fungi, plants, animals. They're all going to have these cells. The key there is to remember, this is probably the thing that was taught most incorrectly in elementary and middle school. Hopefully it was corrected in your biology class. But the idea that plants not only go through photosynthesis, but they also go through this process of cellular respiration as well. But so if you're looking at this picture of a mitochondrion, you can see that I have the 3 steps of cellular respiration labeled here. So I have glycolysis, I have the Krebs cycle, otherwise known as the citric acid cycle, and I have the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, which together would make up oxidative phosphorylation. And so it came up in class a couple of times. Remember, we're making ATP at each of the steps, and that process of making ATP is what leads to phosphorylation. And so that coupling of ADP and inorganic phosphate to make ATP is called chemiosmosis. And in this case, in the electron transport chain, we said, well, that's oxidative phosphorylation because there's oxygen making that process happen. Oxygen is the electron acceptor. It's literally pulling our electrons through the electron transport chain, and that process allows us to pump hydrogen ions and ultimately make ATP. However, in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle, our ATP is made through substrate level phosphorylation, where you have enzymes there that are actually going to make ATP from the same things. You're still making ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate, but it's just a slightly different process in glycolysis in the Krebs cycle than it is in oxidative phosphorylation. So some other things to look at. So remember here, this bottom equation, C6H12O6 or glucose plus O2 or oxygen, makes carbon dioxide, CO2, water, H2O, and ATP. So this is the chemical formula for cellular respiration. So then if you look, you can see where our glucose and our oxygen are going into this process. You can also see then where CO2 and H2O are coming out, and you can see where the ATP is coming out. So I like this picture because while it doesn't show you the details of glycolysis, Krebs, and the electron transport chain, it does show you what's going in and what's coming out in a pretty clear way. And so then I did try the best I could to make these also accurate in terms of where those stages are taking place. So glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm or cytosol. The Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle takes place within the mitochondrial matrix, the very, very inner part. So you have outer membrane, inner membrane. The space in between is the intermembrane space, and all of this space is the matrix. And then the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis happen across this membrane, which is why I drew the box encasing that membrane. So that inner membrane that has the matrix on one side and the intermembrane space is where the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis is going to take place. So then some other things, obviously glycolysis, glucose is coming in. We're getting a little bit of ATP out of this process, but then we're also getting some intermediates. So we get 2-pyruvate or 2-pyruvic acids out of the process of glycolysis. But then remember, we talked in class about how we actually have to change that. So we're going to bring it across the membrane into the mitochondrion, and then we're actually going to change that pyruvate into another molecule called acetyl-CoA. And this is the molecule that will then enter the Krebs cycle. Glycolysis also makes 2 molecules of NADH. Sometimes you'll see it as 2 FADH2. I'm going to stick with 2 NADH just so there's not as much confusion there. But remember that we are reducing NAD plus to NADH. And what that means is we're going to add some hydrogen ion, and we're going to add 2 electrons to this molecule so that now we have a molecule that's essentially carrying some potential energy for us. And that those 2 molecules of NADH are going to go all the way to the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis from glycolysis. So they are not actually entering the Krebs cycle. Then within the Krebs cycle, we make a little bit of ATP, we make some carbon dioxide, which come out of this process, but then we also are going to make some NADH and FADH2. Again, these are carrying potential energy in the form of hydrogen ions and electrons to the last step of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So then, when you get to this step, we take in some oxygen, that's our electron acceptor. We're going to break these molecules of potential energy and harness that energy from excited electrons. And out of that, we're going to make ATP and water as a byproduct. So again, that's a lot of information, but if you can kind of process what's happening where and where it all goes, that will help you. And then seeing that we have some things that we care about a lot about getting out, and then we have some intermediates along the way that allow the process to happen. So then let us quickly look at an overview of photosynthesis then as well. So here I have my equation for photosynthesis, which again is just the reverse of the equation for cellular respiration. I'm going to hide that one completely. And you can see here that we have a different form of energy involved. So photosynthesis is kind of nice because it's a slightly simpler process where there's only two stages taking place. Again, this is happening within the chloroplast, which is an organelle found in plants. And so plants are able to then go through this process of making oxygen and sugar, as well as the other process where they're going to use oxygen and they're going to use sugar. So no, that misconception about plants giving off oxygen only and not using it is false. They do both. They're going to use a little bit of oxygen. They're also going to create it. So they have a very, very important role for life. But so if you look inside the chloroplast then, just to orient you to the organelle, these little chip-like structures are called thylakoids. And when you stack them like this, you'll see them referred to as grana. And then this space inside the chloroplast is called the stroma. Remember we had that talk about mixing up the stroma versus the stoma or stomata. So stroma is the inside of the chloroplast. And then within the thylakoid, that chip, you have the thylakoid space or the lumen. Both words are used. I think your book primarily uses the word thylakoid space. So then, if we look at the 2 reactions, you have the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. Remember that the Calvin cycle can also be called light-independent reaction or dark reaction. And remember, we talked specifically about how the word dark reaction, scientists are moving away from this because it's a misconception. This process doesn't have to happen in the dark. It's just the idea that it doesn't require light. So you see the light coming into this process here, and there's no light coming into this process over here. So let's go ahead and talk about the light reaction. So again, I tried to enclose the thylakoid membrane in this picture so you can see that the light reaction is going to happen across that membrane. So it's going to involve the membrane itself as well as the stroma side and the thylakoid space or lumen side. So then again, if we look down at our chemical equation here, you have carbon dioxide, water, and light going in. So specifically in the light reactions, we're going to use 2 of those reactants. We're going to use the water, and we're going to use the light. And then we'll talk about how this actually happens. It's another electron transport chain, which we'll see in a more detailed video. But then out of this process and using that electron transport chain, we're going to get oxygen out. That oxygen actually comes from splitting this water. And then we're going to attach the hydrogen ions from water to NADPH. And when we do that, we're also going to be carrying some electrons here. And remember, electrons always do work for us. And then we're going to make some ATP. And both of these intermediates are going to be used then in the Calvin cycle. And so kind of interestingly, we have the light reactions, we have the Calvin cycle, but then we have a process of exchanging the intermediates in between here that make both processes run. So then if you're looking at the Calvin cycle, your only other reactant is carbon dioxide, and that goes into this process. And then you get your other product, C6H12O6, or glucose, out. And here, in order for this to happen, we're going to use the energy from both the ATP and we're going to use the energy from the electrons that are carried in this NADPH to do work for us and make this cycle actually run. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Again, just reiterating what goes into these two processes and what comes out. In the next video, I'm going to zoom in specifically on cellular respiration. I'm going to look at glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation very specifically with the nitty-gritty details for those of you who need those to make sense of all of this. Then I'll also have another video on the nitty-gritty details of photosynthesis.